22 years ago this week on June 28th, 1999. It was the night after the King of the Ring ladder match where Vince and Shane McMahon won back control of WWE against Steve Austin. There was a briefcase hanging above the ring for that match, and a mystery person was raising it up higher and higher when Austin was about to grab it. I don't know if it was ever specifically stated that it was the Big Boss Man who was on the outs with the corporation at the time. But when he showed up on Raw the next night to his old Boss Man babyface music, by the way, it was all a swerve. And he hugged all of the corporate team members, so I assume it was him, or we're supposed to think it was him that did it. Austin, though, took out an insurance policy, he said, just in case that very thing happened, and I guess now he had the power to book himself in a WWE title match, which is exactly what he did on Raw as War against The Undertaker, who had a pretty bad match with The Rock the night before. I actually met The Rock for the first time the day before that King of the Ring pay-per-view at a car dealership in Brooklyn, over on Utica Avenue. He did a signing, but I think it was a case where the person who owned the dealership had an in at WWE and knew somebody. It just was so out of, and I have pictures from this, it's so out of place. Like, it just literally, they dropped a table in the middle of this car dealership, and there's The Rock, right before his big pay-per-view match for the championship with The Undertaker. But on this night, he had a better match with Stone Cold. Undertaker did, that is. He had a better match with Stone Cold than he did with The Rock the night before, which saw Austin become only the third man at that point in history to win the WWE title 4 times. The other two being Hulk Hogan and Bret Hart. It remains, to this day, the most watched wrestling match in the history of cable television. It scored an unbelievable 9.5 Nielsen rating and a 17 share. Nearly 1 in 10 homes with cable in this country were tuned into that match. That works out to be about 10.7 million viewers. Raw annihilated Nitro that night, 6.3 to 3.5. 2 days later, on June 30th, 1999, WWE on its website announced it had signed Chris Jericho to a 3-year contract at the same time that he was still technically under contract for another month to WCW. Jericho months earlier had already made the decision to leave for WWE. He wasn't happy with his position in WCW. He didn't see any real upward mobility. And in a funny note, considering how WWE does business these days, the July 12th edition of the Wrestling Observer noted that Jericho did have a 90-day non-compete clause in his WCW contract that should have technically prevented him from debuting there until October. But, and I quote, "Those non-compete clauses haven't been enforced in the past because of the question as to whether they would stand up in court, and he is expected to debut on WWF television in some form immediately after the contract expires." I don't know if that clause would apply, though, if the contract had just expired. When WWE releases somebody early, they're still getting paid. And they have a standard, 90-day clause. I think it's 30 days for NXT talent. But if the contract just runs out, I don't see how they can prevent you from working anywhere that you want. But that would definitely be something to challenge in court. So they didn't waste any time in announcing on their website that Jericho was coming in. And in the July 10th issue of the Pro Wrestling Torch, Wade Keller said that WCW did not aggressively pursue Jericho. His current deal paid him $225,000 a year, and they were planning to offer him a raise up to $450,000 a year for 3 years. The same deal they had offered Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, and Dean Malenko, all of whom re-signed with the company. Now, Jericho had a verbal agreement with Eric Bischoff from over 6 months prior that he was going to re-sign, but when Bischoff dragged his feet on presenting him with the actual contract, Jericho took a secret meeting with Vince McMahon at his house in Connecticut and decided to renege on that verbal deal, which Bischoff was not happy about. Bruce Pritchard on his podcast said the idea of putting the announcement on their website was about beating the dirt sheets to the punch and making their website the main source of information for their audience instead of finding it somewhere else. They tried a similar experiment years later where they started running stories on other promotions like TNA. They were trying to put the dirt sheets out of business, I guess. Yeah, that lasted all of a few weeks. 20 years ago this week, on July 2nd, 2001, Booker T wrestled Buff Bagwell for the WCW title in the main event of Monday Night Raw from Tacoma, Washington, in a match far more important than people may realize. It was the match that single-handedly killed the planned revival of the WCW brand after WWE had bought the company a few months earlier. WWE turned the main event of Raw that night into Nitro, basically, without calling it that. They put the WCW logo in the corner of the screen. They swapped out the ring skirt with a WCW logo skirt. They brought out WCW referee Nick Patrick to officiate the bout. They brought WCW announcer Scott Hudson to do commentary with Arn Anderson, who, while he is a very good promo, he's a good talker, he had never called a match a day in his life before this. Stacy Keibler served as the ring announcer, and of all people to feature in this historic main event, they chose Buff Bagwell to challenge for the championship. The match itself was no good. Whatever was left of the 20,000 or so fans in the building that night at the Tacoma Dome, many of them had already taken to the exits. As soon as the main event started, people started leaving the building. The people that were left booed these guys out of the building. They chanted everything from boring, which was very jarring. Booker T has said that he had never been in that situation before where people chanted boring at him during his match. They were chanting boring. They were chanting this match sucks. They were chanting Goldberg, who wasn't even signed with the company at that time. It was billed as the most awkward match in WWE history by WWE.com back in 2013. These people, you gotta figure that these people in the building that night, they paid to see the stars of WWE. They paid to see Steve Austin. They paid to see Kurt Angle. They paid to see Chris Jericho. They paid to see The Undertaker. And for years, they had been conditioned to see WCW as the enemy. These are the bad guys. We're the good guys. All of a sudden, they're expected to cheer for two guys that a lot of them probably don't even know. Or if they knew Booker, they probably didn't know who Buff Bagwell was. 5 minutes in, Stone Cold Steve Austin and Kurt Angle, the two biggest heels in the company at the time, ran in to beat the crap out of Booker T, and you would have thought they were the two biggest baby faces, the way they were cheered. It was like, thank you for putting us out of our misery. They dragged Booker to the back, they threw him out of the building into the parking lot, then they did the same with Buff, who had joined in the attack and thought, hey, we're all buddies now. He got tossed out of the building as well, and then a week later he was fired, and he never wrestled for them again. And that was the final nail in the coffin for WCW. But it wasn't supposed to be. For months, Jim Ross and Kevin Dunn, they were the point people. They were tasked with working on plans to run WCW as its own brand. Coming up with a roster, booking towns to run in. You got to call these buildings months in advance to book these cities and to book these venues. A lot of that work, a lot of that legwork had already been done. But this was the plan. Coming out of the Invasion pay-per-view, there was going to be a divorce hearing on television with Vince McMahon and Linda McMahon. Their assets would be split right down the middle, with WWE being split into two groups, one of which would be WCW. And WCW would be led by Shane McMahon. They would get the Raw slot on Monday nights. Now, they had tried at first. They went to TNN, which is where, Raw was airing at the time. They wanted a totally new time slot, I think on a Saturday night, and they wouldn't give it to them. Even though Raw was the number one rated show on the network, they were not giving them any more, any new time slots. So the new plan was, we're going to give Raw to WCW because at least Vince McMahon recognized that if we're going to make this work, we can't half-ass this. Raw is our baby. Raw is our flagship show. If this thing is going to have a shot at working, then we've got to go all in here, and we'll give Raw to WCW. Raw will become the WCW show. WWE would get SmackDown. There would be a draft lottery to create the rosters for both shows, and the WCW show would end up with some big WWE names on it because the feeling was, and I agree, that at least at first you needed to have some big WWE names on that show or it would fucking die. Whatever Raw was averaging at the time on television, I mean, that show was going to go down the fucking toilet unless you had stars, name people on the show that people knew. It was a necessary evil, even though, you want to do a proper brand split with WWE and WCW and build to like a massive supercard. You really don't want to have that mixing of the brands like that, but again, you almost didn't have a choice. But this match and the fan reaction to the match killed WCW for good. The invasion angle was their plan B, and that didn't fare much better. And on a side note, they did have plans to debut Jerry Lawler that night with Scott Hudson as the WCW announce team. They had a secret agreement with Lawler, all worked out. But it fell apart when they sent Lawler a contract, but not his wife, the Cat, who was fired earlier that year, and that's when he walked out of the company with her. He was of the impression that she was going to have a deal coming out of this as well, and once he realized that wasn't the case, everything fell apart. When he pulled out, they went with Arn Anderson as the announcer because they didn't have anybody else. 19 years ago this week on the July 1st, 2002 episode of Monday Night Raw, Jeff Hardy came within inches of becoming the undisputed champion in a memorable ladder match against The Undertaker. After it was over, Undertaker, who was the heel, paid respect to Jeff for the effort. He had done the same thing with John Cena on SmackDown after he made his debut like a week before this. He had endorsed John Cena, shook his hand in that backstage segment after Cena's loss to Kurt Angle. This was a period where they were attempting to give some credibility to some of the younger guys. And on the Raw 10th Anniversary special the following year, this match was nominated for Raw Match of the Decade. And when WWE.com compiled a list of the 50 greatest matches in Raw history, they ranked this one at number 5. 18 years ago this week, on the June 30th, 2003 episode of Monday Night Raw, Gail Kim, in her debut appearance, won a Women's Battle Royal to win the Women's Championship, beating out Trish Stratus, Victoria, Ivory, Molly Holly, Jacqueline, and Jazz, who entered the match as the champion, but Jazz suffered a shoulder injury during the match and had to be carried to the back. I believe the plan was always for Gail Kim to win, unless the injury changed that. I don't think it did. I've never heard her in interviews say that it did. So a great way, you would think, right, to start out your career there. I'm winning the championship on my first night. Unfortunately, that was about as good as it ever got for Gail Kim in WWE. She was gone 2 years later, and then she returned to the company in 2009 before leaving for good in 2011, last working a battle royal where she was told, hey, make sure you are out of there in the first minute of the match. So she eliminated herself about 20 seconds in, and she walked, which I don't think is what they had in mind, although they did tell her to make sure she was out of there in the first minute, but she eliminated herself under the bottom rope, because back then with the women's battle royals, you know, any elimination through the ropes didn't have to be over the top. You were gone. And so it was only about 20 seconds in, and she went out under the bottom rope, and she walked to the back with Melina, who had also wrestled her final match for the company. She had just been eliminated. Melina, though, was released from the company about a week later. Gail was completely fed up with WWE by this point, and them never doing anything serious with her. She said, fuck it, I wonder if they'll even notice. If I eliminate myself, I wonder if they will even notice. I don't think they did. I don't think anybody said anything to her. She walked to the back, and not long after that, she quit the company. Although I don't think they let her go, but I think her contract ran out about a month later anyway. So she started her run there in a battle royal, and she ended her run there in a battle royal.